Okay, just before I start, I'd like to thank Ronan and the Global Irish Institute here at the University of New South Wales for inviting me and for letting me present my research. This is work that fundamentally I did during the course of my PhD at Bristol, but it also, as Ronan said, links to wider conceptions of Irishness and also the mythologising of certain aspects of Irishness. So I'll go into that a little bit further as I go through the paper. The reason I picked this title is because I think that looking at the study of prisons, particularly Long Kesh maze, there tends to be a lot of separations of things into black and white. A lot of people fall either one side or the other, whether they think it's an amazing place of triumphalism of Republican mythologies, or whether it's somewhere that should have been decimated and forgotten about. That's something that we don't need to consider now in a post-conflict situation. So I want to look at these kind of these different opinions and look at actually how much greyness there is in the story of Long Kesh maze, and actually how a lot of the realities of the place are quite different from our understandings from the media and from government and paramilitary propaganda. Also, a slight proviso, as I said with the title, it's about political prisoner experiences. Possibly the most disenfranchised group connected to this prison would be the ordinary criminal experience. There was what they called ODCs, ordinary decent criminals, who were kept in the prison as well. But unfortunately, their stories have really not came through, particularly because the political element of it was so important, and it created quite a different prisoner experience from the typical prisoner experiences. And it's very difficult to actually get access to ordinary decent criminals as well, because the government records mean that the records are closed for 100 years on people who are imprisoned in Long Kesh maze, whereas political prisoners tend to join prisoner groups afterwards, and they love talking about their experiences. So I'll just, as I say, give that slight proviso that I can't really go into those full details of the entire prisoner experience. But just to introduce Long Kesh maze, it's probably most famously associated with paramilitary imprisonment during the course of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. It came to major international attention to those who weren't interested in the Northern Irish context, probably in 1981, with the infamous hunger strikes, which resulted in 10 men starving themselves to death during the course of the summer of 1981. Of course, any of us who know a lot about Irish studies, particularly Irish political imprisonment, knows that the hunger strikes is something that had been used throughout political campaigns by prisoners, but this is the first time there was such a concerted effort with so many people dying at once. So it really brought the prison to the public attention then. Since the site was first used, and particularly from this period onward, the prison became a major propaganda tool for both the paramilitaries and the government. It's particularly interesting looking at government files. The strange position that Northern Ireland's in, it has a Northern Ireland office in the British government in London and in Northern Ireland. And funnily enough, the office in Northern Ireland won't open files from a lot of the files from the 70s and the 80s, but London's not quite so reticent about this. So I was able to actually see files that linked to the hunger strikes and how the British government were quite open about the fact that they've seen it as a major propaganda loss, and that the paramilitaries had won the battle for it, particularly in the States and other diasporic communities. So from this time, I think the propaganda value of the prison made it very difficult to get to these different kind of stories beyond the Republican kind of triumphance and the Loyalist kind of reticence to talk about the site. So it's something that I've tried to do as an archaeologist by looking at the material culture of the prison and trying to look at what different stories it can tell us. And I think it's only really now, after the conflict has ended, I put in inverted commas, particularly with dissident Republicans being quite active now, but officially, with the signing of the Belfast Agreement in 1998, the Troubles did end, and the prison was emptied from 2000 onwards. So it's only now, really, the site is able to be accessed and that we can try and get an understanding of what it means and what it meant. So Northern Ireland, the abridged version in 2 PowerPoint slides. We'll see how we can go with this. This is the electoral maps showing Northern Ireland from 1992 to 2001, which shows you the difference in the type of political parties were voted in at that time. There's quite a strong dichotomy from 2001 onwards, with being much more Republican nationalist west of the Bann, which is the west of the province, and the orange colours are much more unionist. So you can see that there was quite a smattering between the two areas. There's been a very strong change in this, in the electoral voting patterns in such a short amount of time, which really reflects what's went on in Northern Ireland since the creation of the state. So Northern Ireland was created in 1921 as a condition of the Irish Home Rule Act. It was selected because it was seen as quite different from other parts of Ireland, and there was quite a strong discontent with the idea of Ireland breaking away from the Empire and from British rule. So these 6 counties were selected because there was a majority of Protestant Unionists, people who lived in the area. And it was consciously created at that time to be what James Craig, who was the first Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, called the Protestant Parliament for a Protestant people. A lot of Catholics and nationalists felt disengaged with the system. They consciously decided not to contribute to the politics for quite a long time. And there was quite active discrimination in quite a lot of different elements of the state, including in housing, in social conditions, in the electoral areas as well. So we could see from the Foyle area, which is around 70% Catholic, didn't have Catholic representation until the late 60s, early 70s. So because of this discrimination with the civil rights movement in the 1960s, in different ways kind of created a situation where the Troubles occurred. But the background of this is that there was centuries of cyclical sectarian violence, which really resulted from the plantations of the late 16th and early 17th century. And this violence, as I said, did occur through different periods and different heightened and lowering of tensions. But with the civil rights movement and the reaction to it in the late 1960s, really what we would call a low-level war occurred, which lasted over 30 years. McKittrick et al.'s book, Lost Lives, which is one of the seminal books which talks about the individual repercussions of the Troubles, which counts every person who died during the course of the conflict, estimates that over 3,500 people were killed between 1968 and 1998, which, if we're looking at a proportion, because of the population of Northern Ireland is quite small at about 1.6 million, this would be equivalent to over 105,000 if you're looking on the UK basis, so it was quite a substantial proportion of the population. It's estimated over half the population were directly affected by death or injury, either to themselves or to a close family member or a friend. And with this also, there was other repercussions which moved beyond the death tolls and also economic repercussions. There was increased ghettoisation of working class areas, growth of paramilitary influences and control, and from this Long Kesh maze was created and became quite an important place, which had quite a strong connection to the course of the Troubles, which we'll look at. And this is an aerial view of Long Kesh maze. This is one of the kind of media views that we would be quite familiar with. And as you can see, the hitch blocks is kind of the iconic image, this aerial view of them. But I'm going to be looking more at a ground level of what the hitch blocks were like. This image was actually taken from inside the maze prison after it closed. It was a photograph that was on the wall. It's actually a great photograph to try and get some sense of what the site was like. The facts of the site is that it's a 360-acre site, which also 270 acres of this was the 2 types of manifestations of prison site. The area at the kind of northeast, which is kind of fairly, you can't really make out very well, used to be an army base which was connected to the prison, which also would have really been counted as part of the site. The army were frequently brought in to quell riot situations, particularly in the early days. There was 300 plus buildings were recorded in a recent standing building survey that was conducted in around 2000. This goes from H blocks down to little shacks, so there was lots of different types of buildings on the site. And the interesting thing about the site from the point of view of an archaeologist is that because, as you can see, it's kind of a greenbelt rural area, they had quite a lot of areas to build on, so they generally didn't knock things down when they weren't needed anymore. They just kept moving on to the next available site. So it was an amazing site to work on as an archaeologist because you could see the development and evolution of the site until it was knocked down, unfortunately. The other really interesting thing about the site is that there was 2 prisons effectively on the same site that were divided. So you can see the hitches in the bottom corner. The area above that was the internment camp section of the site, which I'll talk about in detail in a few minutes. But really what was interesting about it is that the 2 main kind of prison types in the 20th century, which not only were housed on the same site, but were actually used at the same time, When the H blocks were built, the internment campsite was still used for at least another, I think it's another 13 years afterwards. So it's very unusual to get two different prison types being used on the same site at the same time. But the history of the site doesn't date back very far. It was initially used as an American Air Force base during the Second World War. And this had a significant impact on how the site developed from this whenever it was reused again as Long Kesh internment camp from 1971 onwards. The H blocks were built between 1975 and 1978, and they were used until the site closed in September 2000. And the site began to be partially demolished from 2006 onwards, with this gathering pace in 2007, 2008. Just give you a brief overview of where it is. Long Kesh is just outside Lisburn, which is connected by a main motorway to Belfast. So it's an interesting site in that it's a very private site. It's a site that was very strictly kept secret, but also it's in quite a noticeable location. You can notice it from the side of the motorway, which is this is a main road from Dublin to Belfast. The lights of Long Kesh were fairly noticeable until it closed down. So it's one of those simultaneously very public and very private sites at the same time. So again, a brief biography of the site is that it was converted from a disused American Air Force base to an internment camp. As I said, this had quite a strong impact on how the site developed. The old Nissan huts were reused as internment huts for the new prisoners who were brought in. And the runways were used for new Nissan huts to be placed on as foundations because the site's more or less, it's quite marshy, so it's quite hard to dig down very far. So this World War II layout was kind of a basis for the prison until it closed in 2000. As I said, it's a unique site due to the numbers imprisoned. It's quite hard to get a kind of idea of how many people were imprisoned, mainly because they haven't released a lot of the numbers, but also because a lot of the prisoners, I used to work as an archivist in the Public Record Office in Belfast, so I could get access to these things when I probably shouldn't have. But you could actually see that a lot of people went in and out. So people went in, right again 2 weeks later, and again 2 weeks later, out again. So you were constantly seeing the same names turn up on files. So it depends whether you count them as one prisoner or 15/20 prisoners. So per brick is estimated there was about 30,000 imprisoned in the site, but that could be a lot more or a lot less depending on what way you count your numbers. And also, as I say, the nature of the offences. This idea of political imprisonment is very important to the site. Whenever the prisoners were first interned, they were given different statuses as internees, as remandees, as people who were convicted. And the government started to try and take away this political element to imprisonment fairly quickly, which is the reason why there was a huge amount of struggles whenever the H blocks were created, as the prisoners seen this as a means to try and criminalise them, which started really the blanket protests, the dirty protests, and then moved on to the hunger strikes. This idea that the prisoners wanted to maintain the political status, that they didn't see themselves as criminal prisoners. So it made this a very interesting site, but also made the prison body very interesting as well. As I said, architecturally, it's very interesting because of this use of an internment camp and then a H block style cellular type prison, which worked simultaneously for 13 years. And a lot of people tend to forget about the internment camp and how long it was used. Prisoners who were already imprisoned in the internment camp didn't have to move over to the H blocks. They were maybe given remission of years or better conditions if they did move over, but a lot of them decided not to. And I've read some prison officers' journals about the closing of the Long Kesh internment camp, and they talked about themselves being like a forgotten army, because even the other people who worked on the site, they didn't cross over between. You either worked in the internment camp part of the site or you worked in the H blocks. So it's very interesting that even within the prison service, they felt fairly much forgotten about, and also this occurred in public as well. The imprisonment disproportionately affected working class urban communities, and you find certain areas, particularly working class areas in West Belfast, as being decimated. Like entire families were more or less locked up, particularly the male members of the family. There were female prisoners as well who weren't kept at this site. They were mainly kept in Armagh, but in significantly lower numbers. So it had a really broad social, political and cultural impact. It wasn't just about a prison, it was about how it affected its communities. Politically, a lot of the prisoners became politicised in prison. Education was a very important element to them. It's estimated in Long Kesh that the political prisoners were 10 times more likely to take up opportunities to take on education than in a normal prison. And culturally as well, the impact of the prison is very strong. Even today, if you walk around working class areas of Belfast, the wall murals still very much reflect what happened in the hitch blocks. The hunger strikers are still very important. These are, issues that aren't necessarily resolved because the conflict is officially over. So I thought I'd show a couple of images just to try and break away from the text. This is a Nissan hut around 2005, which was the first time I got access to the site. As you can see, some of these Nissan huts wouldn't have dated from the Second World War. The site was more or less burnt to the ground in October 1974, but it's still in fairly good condition for something that's built as a temporary building. They're using corrugated iron, and there's slightly more permanent fixtures to it as well, but it was in fairly good condition for that period, despite the fact that once the site was taken over, they quite like to leave doors and windows open to let air in, allow them to fall down if nobody's looking. So there was kind of an active attempt really to ensure the site didn't last very long, in my opinion, though I probably shouldn't say that being recorded. But and this is one of the former hitch blocks. Again, I find this interesting being a buildings archaeologist fundamentally, because as you can see, the window on the left here has been covered over, which I always think is very interesting to find out why buildings have these little kind of changes made to them. Like this, the hitch blocks were built particularly for this site. They weren't using a plan that pre-existed, but they found out very quickly that the prisoners were able to find out who was coming in and out of the hitch blocks before a lot of the guards knew. So they started covering over windows on certain sides of the hitch block. But again, as you can see, the doors running free open through there as well. So a lot of these sites were allowed to deteriorate very quickly after the site closed. So I want to talk a little bit more about experiences of Long Kesh Maze and look at how it fits into general kind of prison theorization. You can't see this picture fairly well because this is a picture of a picture that I took whenever I was looking at the prison service archives. And this is pictures that prison officers secretly took of prisoners while they were in what is known as the cages, which was the internment camp part of the site. What's happening here is that the prisoners are standing on top of a Nissan hut because there was over 20 different cages which all held separate paramilitary groups. Interestingly, if people were interned or remanded or imprisoned, they had to decide which group they belonged to, even if some of them had been interned who actually didn't belong to any group. So they were more or less put into whatever paramilitary group they decided to affiliate with. So these prisoners are standing watching apparently an Orange Order parade going on in another cage about 2 or 3 down. So it's interesting that these kind of interactions continue despite the prisoners being held in different areas. So with prison studies, I just wanted to look at how Long Kesh Maze and its experiences fit in with it. Until recent decades, studies of prisons tended to either be overly architectural or take a lot of their sources from historical accounts, where there's an emphasis on plans and official documents about how prisons were supposed to work, which I always find interesting because prisons generally don't work very well, is what you find out with the more prisons that you study. So looking at a lot of government documents doesn't always tell you a lot about how the prisons actually were used. The most seminal work was by Michel Foucault, Discipline and Punish, which nearly everybody who studies prisons uses as kind of their grounding, which is really studying how the growth of modern institution, of the prison in particular, links to the relationship with contemporary society and really modernist ideas of how the state became more controlling and tried to view everything that its citizens were doing. Discipline and Punish described modern prisons as having moved from exerting physical mastery to attempting to control the soul and creating what he calls docile bodies, which were broken by extreme discipline and constant supervision. The kind of critiques that Foucault has had of these ideas is essentially a negative view of the ability of the individual or the collective to break beyond limits which have been imposed and controlled by society. And also this idea of free will and the ability of the individual to change or challenge or evolve any of these rules within social norms is also being critiqued, which is one of the things that I really noticed studying Long Kesh Maze, is that the experiences of the institution do really reveal a lot of complexity that are kind of missed in these ideas about imposing discipline and prisoner bodies not being able to do very much about it. As I said, I'll study a little bit relationships. I just put this image up, which I thought was interesting. This is a sorry, I have to go dry throat from all my conferences last weekend. This is evidence of a riot in one of the H blocks where they more or less broke everything in the cells and threw it outside the windows. So I'm just interested in this idea that, you know, the kind of human can have their soul controlled, and, you know, that constant supervision and surveillance actually enables this. What you see from looking at the prisoner reactions in Long Kesh maze is that there's a kind of, the relationship ebbs and flows. At different points, prisoners decide to be compliant. At other times, they decide not to be. And so they frequently showed that they were, you know, walking the line by having kind of riots and destroying objects like this within their prison cells. So I think this idea of relationships being enforced is quite, well, it's difficult to sustain when you look at this example. Relationships within the prison, from what I can see, can't be divided into simple divisions of domination and resistance. The prisoners aren't constantly resisting, and the authorities aren't constantly dominating. Political prisoners had more communal sensibilities than, I would say, normal ODCs, and that they often decide to try and thwart the authorities' attempts to individualize and control them. And this can be over quite small things. When I spoke to ex-prisoners who were there at different periods, particularly those who had been there in the internment camps against those who were there later periods in the H blocks, they talk about sometimes just appealing for things they don't really need, just to maintain this kind of spirit of constantly, you know, being against the authorities, which you'll be able to see in a few pictures some of the things they actually got from constantly, you know, protesting. And also the level of cohesion differed throughout time and throughout paramilitary organisation. You particularly find this difference between the Republican and Loyalist paramilitary groups, and that the Republicans were much more interested in resisting and constantly being shown to resist authorities, where the Loyalists had a much more difficult relationship with it. It's effectively being imprisoned by their own side. You know, they found it difficult doing things that were seen as being Republican and resisting, but also, you know, their communities didn't support them in the same way, and they found a much more difficult relationship with what they should be doing in prison, and how much they should be normal prisoners and how much they should be political prisoners. So, so first of all, look at relationship with prison officers. This is very interesting. During the course of my research, I interviewed an ex-prison governor. He had a really interesting background. He was an English governor who had been brought over to Northern Ireland, and he'd never worked as a prison officer. He came straight in at governor level. And his wife was Catholic, and he was treated rather strangely by, you know, a lot of the prison officers and their families. So he had quite an interesting point of view about this. And he said that he found that controlling prisoners in Long Kesh maze was nearly impossible because the prison officers were more afraid of the prisoners than they were of the prison governor. And so we found this really interesting situation where, you know, the relationship between the two really dictated how well they were able to control the prisoners. And this relationship changed over time, depending on a number of factors: what was happening internally, what was happening externally, and personal relationships between the two. Prisoners talked about seeing a change between the Nissan huts and the H blocks, from the internment camp to the H blocks. One of the people who did oral testimonies for me talked about some of the prison officers when they were on the cages were just like ordinary fellas. There was no big deal, no hassle, but they were transferred down to the H blocks. They were Jekyll and Hyde, you know, they were aggressive, arrogant. And a lot of the prisoners seeing this is that they thought that the prison officers attempted to control the prisoners a lot more. They thought that having this new building would enable them to control the prisoners, when actually I think the structures had very little difference. It was about how much the prisoners wanted to actually resist or allow some domination. One of the later prisoners who I spoke to, who was only in prison from 1988 to 1991 or 92, told me that it's funny how times change, because you see around 89, 90, when Republicans were more or less running the show, you see when the screws still had to check, they would come down on his tiptoes and then lift the flap dead easy, because they didn't want to waken you, you know. So they talked about by that stage that the prison officers really were just trying to do anything they could to appease the prisoners. And this relationship can also be seen in the relationship between prisoners. Animosities weren't just broken down between Loyalists and Republicans. Sometimes greater hatreds existed between the same sides, so to speak. One of my correspondents I spoke to had been in the official IRA, which was the group that the provisional IRA broke away from in the early 1970s. And he talked about the fact that they had quite a good relationship with the UVF under Gusty Spence, who was the leader in the internment camps in the 70s, as he talked about the fact that they had the same kind of socialist sensibilities. And also there was quite a lot of degree of collaboration between the groups, which they did to try and frustrate authorities. One of the people who spoke about earlier said that whenever they were in the Nissan huts, from year to year, the prison authorities used to allow prisoners to have displays or not allow them. And he said one year the UVF boys who were in the next cage were told they weren't allowed to have their Orange Order marches, and the army kept going in and raiding their their cages to make sure they had no memorabilia and they had no flags or anything created. But on the 12th of July, they went out and they had their flags, they had their banners, and the prison authorities were unsure how they did this. But apparently the Republican prisoners in the next cage had held them for them. I gave it back over to them on the night, the morning of, just because they both wanted to annoy the prison authorities. So they at times they could collaborate between each other. And this is another quote from one of my sources who was quite like putting on plays whenever he was in Long Kesh. He said, I remember one time the Loyalists, I think this was about 92 or 93, the governor called me out one day and he said, well, I have a strange request. He says, the Loyalist prisoners down on their block, I forget what block it was, have requested a lend of the lighting and the amplification for the 12th of July. I said, no problem, not at all. We don't own the lighting, yous own it. But he said, yous won't have any objection to them lending it. I said, no. None whatsoever, as long as we get it back in one piece. And the Loyalist prisoners got it for their 12th of July celebrations, and then they sent it back up to us, so it was a wee hand across the divide. So it's interesting when you talk to a lot of the prisoners, they actually don't have a lot of hatred for the paramilitaries on the other side. Saying that, I didn't speak to a lot of Loyalist ex-prisoners, but the Republican prisoners certainly didn't seem to. And then, as I said, the prison relationships externally differ quite a lot between Loyalists and Republicans. Republican prisoners had a significant degree of support and understanding from their own communities. Lawrence McCune talks about how imprisonment was considered a badge of honour, and particularly the paramilitary prisoners who were kept in Long Kesh Maze, it was seen as the place where you had to serve your time. This can be seen in the long-standing interest in the prison, particularly with the hunger strikes, and as I said, they're still very prominent. There's still a lot of internment marches and hunger strike marches. There's still a lot of murals that reflect these ideas. And there's also quite a lot of prisoner artefacts in homes, and the growth, particularly in the post-conflict situation, in local museums and memorials that have been created at this time. Loyalist prisoners, as I said, were effectively imprisoned by their own side, and they tended to have a lot less understanding and support beyond their immediate family and friends. I looked at quite a lot of newspaper reports from around the mid-1970s, and particularly interesting looking at the letters to the editor, that a lot of local Loyalists were very annoyed if they seen Loyalists in the prison appearing to be doing things that were seen as Republican, like going on protests, doing any kind of hunger strikes. So they had to walk a very, kind of narrow line between being able to resist in some ways, but not looking like they were trying to do the same things as Republicans were doing. So often I found within the kind of material culture from the prison, you often see that Loyalist prisoners tend to concentrate on trying to maintain their broader external unionist identities within the prison rather than trying to do a lot of resisting. And I'll just show you a few images to show this. These are two objects that I found in slightly different locations. The letter on the left is a communication, which was a letter from Bobby Sands that is kept by a prominent Republican who keeps a whole file of these communications. Communications were like tiny little bits of paper. They were either written on cigarette paper or written on toilet paper, and they were usually smuggled outside. So there were messages to either individuals or families, but most often they were messages that wanted to be republished on to try and get support from the local community. So anything to do with Bobby Sands is kept in high regard. So this is just a photocopy of one on the left. And on the right is a blood pressure gauge, allegedly, I would say, from Long Kesh Maze. I'm not trying to cast any aspersions on this, but a bit like the True Cross. Of every object you'd ever seen that came from Long Kesh, I think it would hold more than a prison. But you find a lot of these objects, anything at all connected to the prison, and even some security infrastructure, like things like lights that were taken down from army bases that were dismantled, turn up in these type of like local museum collections. With the type of stuff you see connected to the Loyalists, tends to be very strongly connected to their identity and linking to marching and Orange Order. Interesting, a lot of these prisoners probably wouldn't have been in the Orange Order, but they see this as a, a very strong stamp of their identity. So things like this banner that would have been used for marching around compounds and cages, which is a UVF banner. How I could get access to these are all confiscated artefacts held by the prison service in Northern Ireland. And there's a lot of these Orange Order type collarettes. And you even see the level of detail, like the little bits of fringing and bits of tinfoil used to recreate the symbols that would have been on them. Like the kind of level of detail that goes into these, which you don't really see in Republican sides. You don't see so many flags, and the flags you do see tend to be quite generic, socialist flags or tricolours. There don't tend to be a lot of banners like this. So you can see a different type of thing going on, where Republicans are quite strong in their identity and their community support. There seems to be a need within the Loyalist prisoners to try and maintain this. And then looking at murals, as I said, there's a lot of wall murals. Some of them come and go, some of them last quite a long time. This is one commemorating the hunger striker, Joe McDonald, which is located in West Belfast. And you can see from the images in the background, there's quite a lot of media images connected to the prison, like the hitches down in the corner and people on dirty and blanket protests as well. So a lot of these really iconic images connected to the protests. Whereas you don't tend to find this again in the Loyalist community. Any times you see the prison shown, which isn't very often, they tend to be very generic images. You'll see like walls and watchtowers and wire, but you don't actually tend to see anything that associates it with being particularly Long Kesh. You hardly ever see a hitch shown, which again I think is connected to this idea of something seen as Republican, it's not Loyalist then, so they shied away from trying to take on these images. And again, this kind of discomfiture with being connected to imprisonment, be that political or otherwise. So unexpected discoveries. I'll just talk a little bit more about the type of things I found. The prison, a snooker table being my first unexpected discovery. So I was walking through the prison in 2005 and came across this quite new snooker table, and the prisoners did tell me at the time that they got to the stage in the 90s where they had to just keep constantly protesting to maintain their kind of, their activism and their not accepting of being in prison. So they ended up getting things like snooker tables and nice curtains for their cells and, lots of different things like this. And the snooker table was still there whenever I got there. So to the outside world, again, we have to look at the difference between how the site was experienced and how the site is perceived. A lot of the connections to Long Kesh Maze are connected to extreme protests, particularly connected to the dirty protests, the blanket men, the hunger strikes, and this constant struggle between prisoners and the imprisoner. And whilst I'm not trying to say there wasn't prolonged periods of hardship, from really the mid-1970s the whole way through to 1981, 1982, there was, the protests did take over a lot of the Republican experiences. But there are variations in treatment and experience which have been hidden under this kind of protest narrative which has taken over the prison. So through examining this material culture and reading the documents and talking to people who are associated with the prison, you start to see these other realities emerge as well, which are quite different. And so what I want to show you now is a journey through some of the unexpected realities of political imprisonment, some more expected, some definitely less expected. Start with protests, which is the most strong narrative that comes out from the prison. The picture on the left is the site of the internment camp after it was burnt in October 1974. So the vast majority of the site was destroyed at this time and was really an impetus for the hitch box to be built the next year. And this image is the lovely image of the dirty protests and people having to come in and clean the walls after, the prisoners tend to be moved around quite a lot. So after they'd sullied their walls, within a few weeks, they would be moved to another section and the walls would all be cleaned down again. So, the kind of realities of protest, thankfully we don't have any kind of smelly vision, but, would not be all that pleasant. Communications were also very important. You find quite a lot of confiscated radios in the prison service collection, which when you speak to the prisoners were very important because a lot of the times they were unaware of what was going on the outside, how they were being perceived, and even what was going on in other parts of the prison. A lot of the prisoners talked about how they found out about Bobby Sands dying was through someone having smuggled a radio into their cell. And it got quite difficult to do this in the early 80s because they had so little material culture around them. And you find this in the collections that are held by the prison service. There's a lot of artifacts and a lot of variation from the internment camp. And once you get into the hitch blocks, there's a lot less. And a lot of the stuff they do have is much more functional. But you do still find quite a lot of radios from that time. And again, communications, as I said already, with the comms. This is, a piece of toilet paper where someone has drawn a prisoner who's on hunger strike. And so these would have been smuggled out for people to see, the realities of what was going on to an outside audience. So this continual need to be communicating what was happening was something that was, found throughout the course of the prison's life. And also you find quite a lot of weaponry, and again, this mainly relates to the later stages, the early stages of the H blocks, but you don't find so much of it in the internment camps. This rather nasty nail-like device up here actually looks like a pretty horrible weapon, but what they tend to do was throw it into the road so that any of the prison officers' trucks that were coming past had their tires destroyed. So it wasn't actually used as some kind of nasty ninja device. And things like this, where you get a handle and glass had been added to the bottom of it, for again attacking prison officers. And you get a bit of piping with a knife added to the top, and the knife usually had been filed in a way, so to make it sharp, it used to use these kind of butter knives that they had in the, in their own kind of stores. So you do find that there, there's quite a lot of, quite vicious-looking implements that are found. So there was the potential to, terrify or attack prison officers. And also this interesting kind of escaping narrative as well. You find quite a lot of this stuff relating to the internment camp phase. When the prisoners were held in the internment camp, they were held within cages, and they were more or less self-controlling within that. So there was a lot of digging of tunnels that used to go on. Which, to be honest, when you look at all the kind of artifacts that relate to it, I really think was more of an attempt to maintain discipline within the camps actually than a real attempt to escape. As I said before, the internment camps are built on very marshy ground, and it's amazing. They did create tunnels, but it's amazing that they could. It was quite an operation of engineering to be able to do so. But you do find, like this object on the top was a food tray that had been cut in half with a handle added to it to make it a shovel. They created their own lamps that could go down into the tunnel so they could see what they were doing. These bags were created out of blankets, and the prisoners used to walk around the yard to try and disperse the soil. Because otherwise, if the site was raided, if they found a lot of soil, they knew there was a tunnel being built somewhere. And this here is a kind of makeshift ladder that was being created. And the reason I kind of question whether these were actually real attempts to escape is because whenever the internment camp was burnt in October 1974, they used wire cutters just to cut through the wire to be able to do all this. So you find a lot of wire cutters were taken off people. And so it was actually, if they wanted to get out, they could just cut the wire, really. But if you're digging tunnels, it tends to maintain discipline. And there are much more propagandic use being held in an internment camp than they would have been on the outside anyway. So it's this interesting kind of, relationship between wanting to be there and not wanting to be there. But there's also, and this is where I'm kind of entering the more kind of slightly ridiculous element of some of the things that you find there. Leisure activities were quite strongly represented. The image at the side here is of, I expect it's probably Gaelic posts, but it could be rugby posts as well, which were painted on the, in the kind of exercise yard. And a lot of the time the prisoners spent would have been walking around the yard or running around the yard, and they knew how many miles it would take to do so many turns of the yard. So a lot of people's days were kind of concentrated on getting this form of exercise. And as you can see, this image, which is quite dark in the corner, is actually a mini gym, which was also in the cells, as well as the snooker table whenever I went in 2005, 2006. But also, like, a large part of leisure activities would have been connected to education. You can see these mini libraries that were created. You tend to find a difference depending on who was in which section. Loyalist sections tended to have more mini gyms, and the Republican section tended to have more libraries. So you could nearly tell by going into which area, which group had been there for the kind of the last period before the prison closed. As I say, the cultural activities were very strong as well. There's a lot of Orange Order memorabilia, which was held there, but also from photographs you can see that kind of arches were created at the top of corridors. Other pictures show little flags and bunting were put down for around the 12th of July. And even things like this, which was like kind of an ornamental pike that was used for marching and for holding up banners. And the pike head at the top was created out of one of those food trays, which seemed to have been very good for using for quite a number of activities. But you tend to find that quite a lot of inventiveness went into a lot of the objects that were made during this time. Also, there's social activities. It's quite a lot of photographs of individual cells which have been recreated into living rooms or, kind of social areas, which are very interesting, particularly from Loyalist cells. So you can see someone's got the little fireplace with Ulster written on top of it and the clock on the top. And this was a still that was taken out of one of the internment camp cages. There's at least 2 of these bins. I'm amazed you can get a bin in and make a still out of it with no one noticing. But they did find quite a lot of stills whenever they raided. They used to raid the cages every couple of weeks, months, depending on what they were looking for. And this kind of inventiveness, I'm always amazed. I think it's probably the lack of material culture means that you get very good at making things out of, very small amounts of stuff. So this food tray, which I've talked about earlier, we can make a ceremonial axe with added blood. You can also make the shovel. It was to make a radiator as well, which could also be used as a toaster, depending on, how much you wanted to toast your bread. And then the pike as well. So, and actually, I've seen one of the food trays with wheels added to it so that it could be brought into tunnels to take soil out. So there's a lot of different ways of using very limited amounts of material culture. And again, to move away from the trays, in the 70s, there's quite a lot of platform shoes that had bullets installed in them, so you can see the bullet holes through the sole of the shoe. This orange mug had a device in it that was confiscated at some stage, and it says 1992 on it, but that was the year it was accessioned. It's probably from the internment camps. And then this picture of a Mars bar with drill bits in it. And I heard stories of cans of Coke that used to have the liquid taken out and had vodka filled in it, and they were soldiered over. So they used to have quite inventive ways to try and smuggle things in and out of the camp. So lastly, I just want to move on to the post-conflict situation. Just make sure I'm not running over. That's good. Yeah, which I think is interesting. Even this whole nameology, I'm always not quite sure how I'm supposed to call the site. It's one of these double-named kind of Derry Londonderry type things. So as you can see from the background, notice here, it's the Maze regeneration site. Soon becomes the Maze/Long Kesh regeneration site. I always tend to call it Long Kesh Maze just because the first site was Long Kesh and then the name was changed to that. But it can be quite political, how you decide to talk about these places. And I've been very interested in the heritage elements of a site like this. How do you deal with a conflict site in a post-conflict context? And how does society deal with remnants of conflict? Particularly because there were so many remnants. A lot of the time, particularly with ex-army bases and police stations, a lot of these things were taken down quite quickly after the conflict ended. By the time people were fairly secure, it wasn't going to go back to the bad old days, like places like the Andersonstown police station were just knocked down overnight, which I think was kind of quite difficult because these were big landmarks. They weren't necessarily wanted in the areas, but to take them down without letting people even access them or see what was inside, I think was, a kind of slight annoyance to people who lived in the communities. The prison became increasingly controversial from about 2005 onwards. It lay in limbo for about 4 years. And then from this stage, there was the publication of the first of 2 regeneration plans in 2005 and 2006, which were actually quite different. One of them was quite blunt in being about, talking about the political elements of the prison and talking about how it connected to the Troubles and how there was, a certain kind of element that we could learn from. By the next plan, they realised this is slightly too political and started to talk about its educational and economic value, about tourists coming to the site, and even environmental issues, which I'm not quite sure how they connected to it. But you started to find a slicker kind of regeneration plan that tried to avoid the fact that it had been a political prison, that had held political prisoners in it. And there became a lot of debates about this kind of retention-destruction debate, and the ability of what Graham and McDonald talk as a zero-sum site, a site that was just identified with one type of prisoner and with one half of the community, actually having anything that could input into a post-conflict situation. So there was a lot of debates played out by politicians, academics and the media about what was to happen to this site. And I was doing my PhD at the time, and interestingly, it became quotable in newspapers. It was quite strange. Not many PhD students start to find themselves in page 2 of The Guardian, but it just showed the kind of level of interest there was in the site at that time. But what I found really interesting was how the change in political regime had a big impact on what happened to the site. And when the first plan came out in 2005, the two main parties were the Also Unionist Party and the SDLP, which are both like a moderate kind of unionist and nationalist parties. By the time we got to 2007, the two main parties were the DUP and Sinn Féin, which were much more extreme. And so you notice that this kind of change in political consensus had a big impact on what happened to the site. The Sinn Féin were only really worried about the hospital being maintained because that's where the hunger strikers died. But the DUP didn't really want any of the rest of the site kept because it was so identified with Republican ideals and Republican mythology that within a year or two, the site was rather secretly knocked down behind closed doors. There was kind of these, links to how it could be economically viable to try and regenerate the site, and they wanted to put a sports centre on it, which would have rugby, Gaelic, and football on it, so it could be kind of a multi-use, multi-community site, which was kind of in the middle of nowhere, which nobody wanted to go to. But the kind of links to these official explanations of economics and tourism and education were very high in the decision-making process, but actually, there's nothing been done with the site since, so it hasn't really bore out in reality. And so what I was interested in as an archaeologist is that the story of Long Kesh didn't end in 2000, and it didn't end with the regeneration in 2005 or 6. It didn't even end whenever it was mostly demolished in 2007 or 8, because as I went to the site on a number of different occasions during this, you started to see differences in how the site looked. Things got moved about quite a lot, but also things started to disappear as well. And whilst it remained a high-security site with no public access, ex-prisoner groups, politicians and academics mainly had quite a lot of access to the site. And so you continue to see these interactions with the site occurring, and you can see how important some of the artefacts on the site were to the people who had actually been on the site and had some connection to the site. This is the admin block, which is kind of interesting, where the ex-prison officers were. And the site, particularly the elements that were used by the prison officers, was kind of like the Mary Celeste. You'd walk around it, it just looked like it had been abandoned, like people just walked off and left whatever they were doing. You'd find cups with half a cup of tea from 3 years ago sitting there. And things like this, where there's playing cards and crutches. And the ingenuity of the ex-prisoners who went in, by the time I went back to this site in 2007, none of this stuff was there. Even the crutches had disappeared by that stage. And because I was talking to one of the guides who was from the Office for First Minister and Deputy First Minister, and he hadn't realised the crutches had gone until we walked in, and they disappeared as well. So absolutely everything had disappeared over the course of a couple of years. Anything that couldn't be nailed down had been taken as little trophies. And I think this is most evident when you look at, this is supposed to be Bobby Sands' bed in the hospital. Everyone knows the cell that he's supposed to have died in. And apparently this bed, is almost probably not from the early 1980s, but it's the bed that's in the room. So this picture was taken in 2005. When I went back in October 2007, you started to notice a lot of the bed springs had disappeared, which I actually found really poignant, that people weren't taking off, trying to smuggle the bed out, because there is actually a bed in one of the local museums. I'm not quite sure how they got it. But these little tiny interactions where people were just trying to take a little tiny piece of, something that they find iconic. And by the month later, there was hardly any of the bed left. So I'm not sure if maybe the paint's been shaved off by this stage, but I haven't been on the site since November 2007. So it's interesting just, how people continue to interact with a site that is considered closed and defunct and not being used anymore, that actually it still has meaning and it was still being used, even if it wasn't holding prisoners anymore. So just to conclude, what I hoped I showed from this talk is that the narratives of Long Kesh, which have been dominated by narratives of protest and victory on one side and distaste at triumphalism on the other, actually reveal quite different stories when you look at the material culture of the site. I think the study of material culture shows this grey in the middle, that the site meant different things to different people at different times, and it's very hard to pinpoint exactly what it means to anybody, but also that the context of the site's really important. The story of the site didn't start with the internment camp, it starts with the World War II camp, which dictates how the internment camp developed. And it doesn't end with closure. You know, it's still continually being interacted with now. And it's not confined to the physical site either. You know, we need to look at imagined landscapes, how a site like this, which wasn't experienced by the vast majority of people, actually becomes somewhere that's mythologized, an imagined site. But also, in the post-conflict society, you have to look at the place of a site like this. I think that in a place which has a difficult past, then looking at a site like this reveals the complexities of that. It highlights these grey areas and shows that identity and belonging aren't static, and that we can question interpretations, that a site belongs to one particular past, to one particular group, and actually has a much more nuanced and probably difficult story to tell. So, thank you.